71-year-old Robert Herron lived in Jackson, Mississippi with his 73-year-old wife, Annie Laurie. Annie was from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. She had grown up on 14th Street, and according to her cousin, she was one of the most popular, beautiful girls in Tuscaloosa, outstanding in every way. Robert and Annie had met while they were students at the University of Alabama. While at university, she had worked as the women's editor for the school newspaper Crimson White. Robert had also worked on the paper too. In 1940, Robert and Annie would marry. After the wedding, they moved to Jackson, Mississippi. During World War II, Robert joined the United States Navy, and upon his return, he worked for the U.S. Gas Company until 1955. The pair had 2 children together, a son, Robert Jr., and a daughter, Laurie. Robert Herron was one of Mississippi's wealthiest residents. He was worth roughly $200 million. He was in charge of Mississippi Valley Gas Company, the largest gas distribution company in the state, Lamar Life Corporation, the second biggest insurance company, and the second biggest bank, Trustmark National Bank. Annie was frail, weighing 120 pounds and standing at 5 feet 4 inches, suffering from both arthritis and scoliosis. But she didn't let any of that stop her from being a huge part of her community. She devoted much of her time to various civic causes, making her popular and well-liked. She was the president of both the Jackson Junior League and the Jackson Opera Guild, was the co-chair of the Mississippi Arts Festival and the patron of the Jackson Symphony. She and her husband also funded scholarships and colleges. Another one of Robert's business ventures was being the president of School Pictures, which sold franchises across the country. People would buy the franchise and then take and publish children's picture day photographs. The business ran into problems. In the early 1980s, they filed lawsuits against 12 franchise owners from across 8 different states. They were owed money and so started legal action to recover it. July 26, 1988 began as any other. Although he was in his 70s, Robert would often wake up at 4 a.m. to go to work. Both he and Annie were up early and the pair had breakfast together, just as they had done for the past 48 years. Every 2 weeks, Annie would host a bridge club at the house, 139 Woodland Drive, and on this day, this is exactly what happened. Bridge began at 10:15 and went on for several hours. The group spent their time playing, talking, and eating blueberry ice cream cake. At 2:30 p.m., her last guest left and the housekeeper left at 3. 90 minutes later, at 4:30 p.m., Robert came home and saw her car was still parked on the drive. After checking the house, however, she wasn't there. He assumed that she had gone with her friends, however. By 7:30 p.m., she still hadn't come home. He called his son-in-law to help find her. They searched the house and the outside, but she was nowhere to be found. Robert called around other friends and family to see if they had seen or heard from her. Nobody had. She was a creature of habit, which made her sudden disappearance even more unusual. She always took her handbag with her whenever she went out. Worryingly, her bag and shoes were by her reading chair, as was the paper and her glasses. At 9:49 p.m., Robert called the police. They quickly descended on the scene. A sinister discovery was made. A letter by the door. It had been written on a typewriter, was littered with grammatical errors, and was directly addressed to Robert. It read, "Robert Herron. Put these people back in the shape they was in before they got mixed up with school pictures. Pay them whatever damages they want and tell them all this so they can know what you are doing. But don't tell them why you are doing it. Do this before 10 days pass. Don't call the police. If any is dead, pay his children." It then went on to list 12 names. They were the people that School Pictures had taken legal action against regarding the unpaid debts. 11 of them were living and 1 had since died. The contents of the letter made it clear. His wife had been abducted. As it was apparent that the kidnapping was linked to Robert's business, the police needed to know of any enemies and any that held a deep enough grudge that they would hurt his frail wife. Jackson Chief of Police J.R. Black said, the note said not to call the police. However, Mr. Herron notified the police prior to the note being discovered. What was unusual about the letter was that the kidnapper was not demanding money for himself. He was demanding payment for other people. It didn't give a figure that needed to be paid. The lawsuits had been filed from the county court in Mississippi. Their names were a matter of public record and were easily available to the public, meaning the kidnapper didn't necessarily have to be one of the people listed on the ransom letter. Their son Robert Heron Jr. said, "We wanted to comply. We wanted to do everything we could to get Mother back." Searches throughout the house continued. Drops of blood were found on the carpet alongside a smear of blood on the front door. It was discovered that the blood type was the same as Annie's. Investigators theorized that she had been overpowered by someone and potentially hit over the head with something that the smeared blood also pointed to. Alongside having arthritis and scoliosis, Annie suffered with a chronic intestinal disease called teeth, which causes inflammation of the small intestine. If she failed to take her medication, she would die within a matter of days. Her medication was still in the bathroom. The case involved multiple law enforcement agencies, and they called on the help of the FBI that very night. Across the investigation, more than 100 FBI agents were brought in. The FBI contacted attorney James Tucker, who could advise them on the complex legal issues as the case continued to unfold. As day broke, evidence technicians and FBI officers were still trawling through the house, gathering as much evidence as possible, including handwriting samples and notepads, to see if the letter had been written using paper from inside the home. It also meant they could rule out any handwriting if more communications came through. They had officers tap the phone just in case the kidnappers called. Due to the nature of the case, the media put a 24-hour blackout on the story, and her abduction was not reported on. 36 hours had now passed since the abduction, and police were hopeful that the test carried out on the ransom letter would give them a solid lead. The paper didn't match any paper found inside the Heron residence. They also compared the typeface of the letter to every single typewriter manufactured in the 20th century. Tests confirmed that it was a royal typewriter that had been made between 1912 and 1927. No other information or evidence could be garnered from the letter, including fingerprints. One of the Heron's neighbors, a doctor who lived down the street, reported to investigators that he had seen a white van parked near his house. He said he initially thought nothing more of it, but found it strange when he came home later and it was still parked in the same spot. He approached the driver of the van, who was reading a map, and asked if he needed anything. The driver was agitated and responded by asking if it was illegal to park in the neighborhood. A few minutes later, the van drove off. Another neighbor also had something interesting to tell the police. 3 months earlier in April, they too had seen a white van driving around. Both times, the van would have had a clear view of Robert and Annie's house. This neighbor found the van to be so out of place and odd that they made a note of the license plate. Officers ran checks on the plate, but discovered it had been stolen from a vehicle at New Orleans Airport. So this lead went nowhere. So determined were the FBI to find Annie, agents would actually move in with Roberts and live with him as the investigation continued. The police asked school pictures to go into their files and look at the records of the 12 people listed on the letter. They sent letters to the 11 surviving people asking what monetary damages they had and what, if anything, they wanted. They only got a handful of responses, with those who replied saying they didn't want anything. Within 3 days of the abduction, the FBI reached out to officers from areas that the 11 living people listed on the letter resided in to gather more information, and they began conducting surveillance operations on them. They needed to know if any of them had been in the area at the same time as the van or kidnapping. On the 3rd of August, the police made an announcement. They were looking for a Newton Alfred Wyn in connection with her disappearance. Wyn had been one of the names on the letter. Neighbors said that Wyn generally did match the driver of the van. And that very day, he went in front of a grand jury and said he had no knowledge of what had happened to Annie. The investigations continued. As the days passed without any more leads, agents spoke to Robert Heron, and it was agreed that a press conference would be held. More than 10 days after her abduction, Robert made an appeal to the kidnappers. The story quickly became news across the country, with major news outlets including the New York Times, Time magazine, and the Washington Post reporting on it. Following the press conference, the hope was that the kidnapper would be spurned into giving more information on how Annie could be released. It seemed to work. August 15th, 1988. A letter arrived, postmarked from the 12th of August and from Atlanta, Georgia. The letter was dated August 10th. It said, "Bob, if you don't do what these people want you to do, they are going to seal me up in the cellar of this house with only a few jugs of water. Please save me. Annie Laurie." FBI experts said it was her handwriting. The language on the letter was unusual. Family members said she would have used the word basement and not cellar and bottles of water instead of jugs of water, making it apparent that the letter had been dictated to her. But this threw up another problem. If the wording of the letter had been decided upon by someone else, they had no way of knowing if the date of the letter was even accurate. It again was vague, and so in a desperate attempt to comply, Robert Heron had his lawyers find out exactly how much the people in the lawsuits had been sued for. He then sent them all checks. The amount paid out totaled $931,000. Half of the checks would be returned. With every check, he added a note begging for his wife's return. This lead would also go nowhere. Dr. Rodrigo Galvez, a pathologist and psychiatrist, was also brought on board to analyze the letter and help investigators determine what kind of person they were dealing with. He said, "I am absolutely sure she is dead." They got in touch with the behavioral science units where profilers determine the characteristics of people to help officers in their investigations. One of the profilers who examined the ransom letter confirmed that whoever had taken her was likely one of the people listed on the letter. The grammatical errors the profiler believed was a deliberate attempt by the kidnapper to throw investigators off the fence, as was the old typewriter. One particular phrase stood out to the profiler: "Pay them whatever damages they want." The use of the word damages was odd. It's a legal term indicating whoever had written it had some sort of legal background or knowledge of the law. According to the profiler, this was revenge against Robert Heron. Whoever the kidnapper was, they were paranoid and willing to go to any lengths, including murder. It was most likely a white, middle-aged male, someone working alone, or if they were working with someone, this man would have been in charge. Tom Montgomery, a special agent in Jacksonville, was drafted in to look at the one lawyer on the letter, Alfred Wyn. After conducting the routine background checks, it was discovered that he had no criminal record. As part of the legal action taken by School Pictures for the unpaid debts, Wyn had been ordered to pay $153,883 in 1984. Wyn either wouldn't or couldn't pay. So Robert Heron had gone back to court to seize property to pay off the debt. March 11th, 1989. Finally, the news came through that everyone had been waiting for. The FBI had made an arrest in a car park in DeLand, Florida. Alfred Wyn was taken into custody. But who was he and what had led to this? Over the last few months, the FBI had been tracking him and had launched an elaborate undercover operation to catch him. He had been on their radar from very early on. Alfred Wyn was a 65-year-old civil lawyer from St. Petersburg, Florida, who lived alone above his office. Officers had gone to interview him initially, and he said he had nothing to do with the case and gave an alibi for the day of the kidnapping, saying he had been in a bar with a sex worker. He said he had called one of his paralegals and asked him to bring the money to the bar so he could go home with the sex worker. The paralegal arrived and handed the money over. Wyn said he didn't know either the sex worker's name nor the bar they had been in. The next day they visited the paralegal, who confirmed Wyn's version of events. The paralegal said he too didn't know the name of the bar. Wyn had paid for the paralegal's training, and the paralegal was working on a very small salary, leaving officers to believe that there was a great deal of loyalty between them. Despite their protestations, agents would doubt for that they were being honest. The paralegal said that the issues between Wyn and School Pictures had started around 7 years before, when they had foreclosed on him. To try and avoid his debts, Wyn had tried to declare bankruptcy, not once, but 3 times. A court order was issued to pay off the debts. A U.S. Marshal seized items in stock, including his prized car. 3 weeks before Annie Laurie Heron had been abducted, had been told about an eviction hearing, but he put his foot down and said he wasn't going to leave. The paralegal said that becoming involved in School Pictures had ruined Wyn's life. They pulled information on the paralegal's vehicle and vehicles that belonged to friends and associates of Wyn. They found that the paralegal had a white van registered to him, a white van that Wyn had used. An agent went to speak with the previous owner of the van. She revealed that the person who had bought the van was Wyn. She described his behavior as strange, and he told her he didn't want his name linked to the van in any way, so she had left the buyer's name on the receipt blank. It was revealed that the van had been in a repair shop on the day Annie Laurie Herron had vanished. 1 week after the kidnapping, officers had the doctor who had seen the van driving around the area come to the station to see if he could pick out a photograph of the driver. He identified Newton Alfred Wyn. The other neighbor who had seen the van was also able to pick Wyn out as being the driver. They kept him under surveillance, hoping he would lead them to Annie Laurie Herron. When Robert Herron had sent the checks out following the handwritten letter from Annie, according to Wyn's paralegal, when Wyn opened the check to the sum of around $145,000 and read the note begging for Annie's return, he responded saying, "This is not what I wanted." What he wanted was his property back. Wyn sent the check back and added a note saying he hoped Robert would find his wife safe and well. 2.5 months after Annie's abduction, her case would be featured on the hit show Unsolved Mysteries. After the episode went out, hundreds of tips began to come in, and one in particular stood out. An anonymous caller contacted the police and told them that if a man called Newton Alfred Wyn was on the list, they needed to look at him. When agents realized she was a spiritual advisor, they weren't entirely sure, but soon learned she had a strong reputation amongst law enforcement and had helped them before. She explained to them that she had met Wyn 4 years ago. He had sought her advice about the issues he was having with school pictures. She told him that the courts were the best way for him to pursue action against the company. He said he had already tried that. He said to her, he wanted to abduct the company's head and hold them hostage until his demands were met. He said he was looking for an accomplice and called her 6 weeks later to ask if she would do it. She refused. She gave the agents the record she had for her meeting with Wyn. She also agreed that she would contact him, arrange a meeting, and her office would be bugged. He agreed, and the meeting took place in December. She explained to him that she had seen that Annie Laurie Herron had been kidnapped and asked if he had played any part in it. He denied it, saying he had changed his mind. As soon as he left the office, FBI agents were hot on his tail, but he didn't lead them to Annie. The FBI also found out that he was the owner of a cabin located in swampland, and so they headed straight there hoping they would find her, but she was nowhere to be found. The FBI searched other properties and swamps in the vicinity, but there was no trace of Annie Laurie Herron. Newton Alfred Wyn sent thousands of documents to the IRS and told them to search for any disputed financial documents. Attorney James Tucker would say that this appeared to be an attempt at intimidation. In amongst all the paperwork, something sinister was found. Letters talking about a kidnap and murder plot. The IRS informed the FBI immediately. They were sent between Wyn and his ex-girlfriend and detailed a plan to abduct and murder her former husband. They even made reference to using an old typewriter to type out the ransom letter. They went to talk to her, and at first she denied any knowledge or involvement. She then came clean. She said that the plan to kill her ex-husband had been Wyn's idea, and when she realized he wasn't joking, she ended their relationship. She said that she had last spoken to him on August 6, 1988, when he asked to meet with her in DeLand, Florida. He asked her if she knew or thought she had been followed there, and he asked her if her car had been tapped. When she confirmed that she hadn't been followed and the car wasn't bugged, Wyn offered her $500 to travel across state lines to the state capital of Georgia, Atlanta. He wanted her to put a letter in the post for him. He had used gloves to remove a manila envelope from his pocket. This, he said, contained the letter to be mailed. It was wrapped in a gray napkin. Wyn told her to pay for a one-way flight to Georgia from Daytona Beach, in cash, and to use an assumed name. She explained that he had told her to change her appearance once she got to Atlanta. She was to talk to nobody and take public transport instead of a taxi to a post office in East Point. He told her to book a flight back to a different airport in Florida, also to be paid in cash. He told her not to touch or even look at the letter. All she had to do was put it in the mailbox. Based on his instructions, she had even used a fake Scandinavian accent to avoid detection. Despite his orders, however, she had seen the address on the envelope when she posted the letter, and was later able to confirm that the letter Robert had received from Annie was the one she had put in the post. This was just over 2 weeks after the kidnapping of Annie Laurie Herron. She told agents that she had got rid of the napkin on a deserted road and agreed to take them there. The chances of finding it there were slim, but unbelievably, the napkin was still there. His ex-girlfriend agreed to meet with him again at the request of the FBI. She would be wearing a wire. They had told her to be more forthright with him and tell him that she knew she was now implicated in a crime. Wyn denied everything and made no mention of Annie or the plot. When he got out of the car, officers moved in and took him into custody. A search of his office was conducted and a vintage typewriter was found, but tests determined it was not the one that had been used to write the ransom letter. It was believed that a different typewriter had been left at the office to confuse the investigation. In his office, they also found a business card for a car rental company. The company confirmed that he had rented white vans on 3 separate occasions. Whilst the dates of the rentals didn't match the day Annie was kidnapped, one of them did coincide with when the doctor had spoken to the man in the white van who was parked near the Herron home. Wyn was held at the Simpson County Jail while he awaited trial. He refused to have the court appoint a lawyer, but said he couldn't afford one of his own. He told Magistrate John R. Countess 3, "I used to have some money. I have nothing now." Judge Countess told him, "If I appoint you a lawyer, I'm going to appoint you one who will be competent and I believe will do you a good job." Judge Countess did appoint a local lawyer to advise Wyn, but he said he would represent himself. Judge Countess told him this was not a wise thing to do. Although he was a lawyer, he had never tried a federal criminal case. By this point, FBI agents still hadn't questioned him. Jackson FBI spokesman J. Stuart Murphy said, "We don't have a right to talk to him. He has a right to an attorney before he talks to anybody. He does not have an attorney appointed right now. It's kind of confusing." Judge Countess didn't set a bond for Wyn. Hinds County District Attorney's Office said they were considering if it was possible to file capital murder charges despite having no body. But this didn't happen. The federal trial began in Mississippi on January 29, 1990 and would last for 2 weeks. On federal charges of extortion by mail, perjury, and conspiracy to kidnap. Both the paralegal and his ex-girlfriend were told they would face no prosecution if they testified truthfully. It was revealed that by July 1988, papers had been filed by school pictures to evict Wyn from the apartment he lived in and the office he worked from. The prosecution said that the closer the eviction date came, the more determined he was to carry out the plan. The paralegal had taken 4 trips to Jackson. Wyn told him to watch the Herron house and take photographs. The paralegal admitted he had fabricated the alibi of the bar and the sex worker to protect Wyn, but said he knew nothing of and played no part in the kidnapping. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 40 minutes before they returned their verdict. Newton Alfred Wyn was found guilty on all 3 counts. When the jury's verdict came back, Wyn gave a slight smile and said, "What is there to say?" He was sentenced to 19 years and 7 months in prison. Her family and loved ones cried as the verdict was read out. Her son said, "We're informed that the investigation into whatever happened to my mother is continuing, and on that basis we're very pleased with the result reached today." Wyn's sister said, "It's not always the right verdict. I don't think he's guilty. He's not that kind of person." Prosecutor James Tucker said it could not be proven that Wyn had actually been the one to commit the abduction, but they were sure he had played a part in the plot. Wyn would appeal his conviction. It went before the U.S. Court of Appeals, but was flatly denied. Wyn would be released in April 2006, but maintained he had nothing to do with the kidnapping of Annie Laurie Herron, nor the extortion plot against her husband. Newton Alfred Wyn died in 2012. 2 years after the disappearance of his wife, Robert Herron sadly died in November 1990 at the age of 73 following a heart attack. He died without ever finding out what had happened to his beloved wife. Annie Laurie Herron was declared legally dead in 1991. A memorial bench was put up by her husband's grave in Lakewood Memorial Park. Robert Jr. spoke about the complex emotions they were all dealing with as a result of his mother's abduction. It has been nearly 34 years since Annie Laurie Herron disappeared. She has never been found and her whereabouts remain unknown. It is the hope of her family that she will one day be found and they will finally have some comfort in knowing her fate and being able to lay her to rest. The 1980s marked a period of growth and development in Tampa Bay, Florida. In 1989, Tampa was already a popular tourist destination with beautiful beaches and diverse attractions like Busch Gardens and the Salvador Dali Museum. The region experienced economic growth with sectors such as tourism, agriculture, shipping, and manufacturing contributing to its prosperity. And amidst this prosperous tourism hotspot, some tourists noticed 3 dead bodies floating in the sea on June 4, 1989. Joan Jo Rogers was born on November 12, 1952, to Wilhelm and Virginia Etzler. Later, she married Hal Rogers, and they settled on a farm in Wilshire, Ohio, living an idyllic life. On February 22, 1972, their first daughter, Michelle, was born. And on October 6, 1974, their second daughter, Christy, was born. Hal and Joan Rogers regularly took good care of their animals. Their daughters, Michelle and Christy, loved the animals on the farm and found great joy in their happy life, despite the hard work on the farm. Michelle, even though she had some tough times, she always looked out for Christy. They both went to school, and Michelle had a boyfriend named Jeff Feesby. However, Michelle had been through something terrible involving her Uncle John, Hal's brother, who had once blindfolded Michelle and assaulted her. Hal and Joan didn't know about it until the police arrested John for attacking another woman from the same town. Due to the disturbing things Michelle had seen, she was very protective of her baby sister. Christy was a bubbling and outgoing girl. She was a cheerleader, loved softball, and was very close to her father. She looked up to Michelle, even though they had their arguments as sisters do. Michelle was sometimes jealous of the attention Christy got from their father, but despite her struggles, Michelle always cared for her little sister. The family faced many challenges on the farm, but Jo was the strongest. She worked long hours at 2 jobs and took care of the family and the animals. She was often exhausted, but she never stopped working. On Friday, May 26, 1989, 36-year-old Jo Rogers and her 2 daughters, 17-year-old Michelle and 15-year-old Christy, went on a long-awaited road trip to Florida. They left their farm in Ohio and were looking forward to enjoying a family vacation. Jo, who worked the night shift at a distribution center, was excited to give her girls their first vacation. They left Jo's husband, Hal, to take care of the farm and drove their Oldsmobile Calais south on Interstate 75. Their plans included visiting theme parks and enjoying the Florida sun. They visited the Jacksonville Zoo, Silver Springs, SeaWorld, Epcot, and Disney's MGM Studios, having a great time away from farm responsibilities. On June 1st, they reached the motel in Tampa and were thinking about going to Busch Gardens. Michelle called her boyfriend Jeff to have a conversation with him. At 12:57 p.m., the family made another call to Busch Gardens. At night, the Rogers women were seen happily dining at the motel's restaurant by a businessman. But after that evening, they mysteriously disappeared. The last photo they took in their motel was Michelle getting ready for their next adventure. Sadly, they never got to see the sunrise again. Hal Rogers anxiously waited for Jo and his daughters to return from their Florida vacation. Even though he hadn't heard from them for days, he tried to stay positive, hoping they were all right. As time passed, his worries grew and he wondered where they could be. On June 4, 1989, the Amber Waves, a sailboat returning to Tampa from Key West, spotted something troubling in the water. They saw what looked like a body of a woman floating face down. Her hands were tied behind her back, her feet bound, and a thin yellow rope was around her neck. She was unclothed from the waist down. Someone on the Amber Waves radioed the Coast Guard, and a rescue boat was sent from the Bayboro Harbor Station in St. Petersburg. The Coast Guard crew located the body and had difficulty retrieving it. There was something heavy attached to the rope around her neck, making it hard to bring her up. They noted the location and cut the line around her neck, placing her in a body bag before heading back to the station. However, before reaching the shore, they received another distressing message. Another female body had been spotted by 2 people on a sailboat. This time it was 2 miles off the pier in St. Petersburg. Like the first body, this one was also face down, bound with a rope around the neck and naked from the waist down. The same Coast Guard crew went to recover it. As they were dealing with the second body, Another call came in, a third female floating on a short distance away to the east. Once the third body was also recovered, all 3 bodies were brought to the Coast Guard station for examination and to be photographed by the arriving investigators from the Florida Marine Patrol. They were in a state of decomposition, making identification challenging. The women's hands and feet were tied in a similar manner, and the second woman had managed to free one hand before dying. Duct tape covered their mouths, and the second and third bodies had concrete blocks tied to the ropes around their necks. It was believed that the first body also had a concrete block tied to its rope. Detectives suspected that the woman may have been assaulted and then thrown alive into the water with concrete blocks tied to their necks, causing them to drown. The discovery of the 3 murdered women shocked the community, leading to a massive investigation. Divers searched the waters for evidence, and police boats looked for more bodies in the bay. Autopsies were conducted to find out how they died and gather more clues. Since the bodies had no IDs, detectives tried to identify them through their clothing and jewelry. One of the women, the oldest, had long brown hair and was found in a black t-shirt with a gold wedding band on her left hand. Another had medium-length brown hair, wore a peach-colored shirt, and had 3 cloth bracelets with pink, green, and white stripes on her left wrist. The third woman, the youngest, had wavy brown hair and was dressed in a black tank top over a blue bikini top. She had 4 rings on her left hand, 2 gold and 2 silver, 1 on each finger. The struggle she put up allowed her to free one hand from the rope around her wrist. While Joe Rogers' husband, Hal, waited anxiously at the farm, he grew more worried as the days passed without any news from Joe and the girls. He called Joe's friends and relatives to check if they had heard from her, confirmed with her boss at the distribution center about her return date, and reported them missing to the authorities, but nobody had any information. Then, early one night that week, Jeff Feesby, Michelle's boyfriend, called Hal. He had received a postcard from Michelle with a picture of a girl in a bikini and a bull gator and the words "Fun Times in Florida" on the front. Hal asked Jeff to bring it to the house. As he read the postcard repeatedly, he couldn't find any clues about what might have happened. Feeling desperate and determined to do something, he went to his bank on Wednesday and withdrew some money. He had a plan in mind. Hal decided to conduct his own search from the air. He would find a private plane and a pilot, and together they would fly over the roads that Joe and the girls had taken from Ohio to Florida. On Thursday, June 8th, the maid at the Days Inn Tampa noticed something strange about room 251. The guest had checked in a week ago, but the room seemed untouched since then. The beds were neat, the bathroom was unused, and personal items were left behind. The maid became suspicious and shared her concerns with the hotel's general manager. They decided to call the Tampa police to report the guest might be missing, especially given the recent news about the 3 bodies found in the bay. The Tampa police arrived and realized that the room could hold crucial information about the women's identities. They sealed off the room and called for support from detectives in both Tampa and St. Petersburg. The investigators carefully searched the room, taking photographs, collecting fingerprints, and examining all personal belongings. A technician matched the prints found in the room, including those on a tube of an Oral-B Sesame Street toothpaste with the prints taken from the bodies in the bay. It was confirmed that the room belonged to the same 3 women. Meanwhile, the detectives started to make initial identifications using the information found in their purses and the registration from the front desk. Once they identified that the 3 women were Joe, Michelle, and Christy, they now called Hell in Ohio. On that same day, 2 significant events occurred in Tampa Bay. Firstly, the police started looking for the car the women drove when coming to Florida. They were able to gather information about its make, model, and license plate from the motel registration form. Unfortunately, the car was not found in the Days Inn parking lot, so they expanded their search to the nearby areas and eventually located it at a boat ramp along the Courtney Campbell Parkway just a few miles away. The car seemed untouched since Joe and the girls had left it there a week ago. It was locked and the passenger seat was pushed forward as if someone had recently gotten out from the back seat. Inside the car, they found a Clearwater Beach brochure, a deck of Uno cards, and a puzzle book that someone had been working on in the back seat. On the front passenger seat, there was a piece of Days Inn stationery with directions written by Joe herself, guiding them from the motel to a boat ramp. The direction said, "Turn right, west on 62.5 miles on right side, alt before, bridge." Besides these words, there was one more instruction, blue with white. Now, one thing seemed likely. The individual responsible for this crime probably owned a blue and white boat. The second major breakthrough, which was quite shocking, occurred when one of the investigators received a call from the chief of detectives at the Van Wert County Sheriff's Office. The detective wanted to ensure that the team investigating the homicides knew all the relevant facts about the Rogers family. He shared information about Michelle and her uncle, John Rogers, who was now in prison for assaulting a woman. He had also previously blindfolded Michelle and assaulted her. Although John was in prison at the time of the murders, the investigators couldn't overlook the striking similarities between what happened to Michelle on the farm and the events in Tampa Bay. In both cases, Michelle seemed to have been bound and assaulted. This raised the possibility that John might have orchestrated the murders from behind bars, possibly arranging for someone with a boat to take them out on the water. To get a clearer picture, they needed to learn more about the Rogers family. Understanding Joe, Michelle, and Christy better could lead them to discover how they ended up on the bay that night. Alone was someone who intended to harm them. The very next day after identifying the bodies, two detectives flew to Ohio to delve deeper into the Rogers family. The detectives questioned Hal about his brother, John Rogers. Hal clearly stated that John was a loner, and at the time of the missing and eventual death of the Rogers women, he was in jail. There was no way he could plan a murder from inside the cell, as he had no connections with his prison mates. But during their inquiries, the detectives discovered unsettling information about Hal himself. They learned that Hal had posted John's bail when he was accused of assaulting a woman, and despite later learning about the allegations involving Michelle, he kept his word to support John. Hal explained that he wanted to keep peace within the family and believed that someone was lying. He had also said that he had already promised Joe that he would pay for his bail before he knew about the Michelle incident, and so he had kept his word. Another peculiar incident was a $7,000 cash withdrawal Hal made while the girls were missing. He explained that he needed the money to search for his family in Florida, as he didn't believe in credit cards. However, before he could carry out his plan, he learned of their deaths. After numerous interviews with Hal, the detectives found no concrete evidence implicating him in the murders. They observed his grief-stricken demeanor and accepted his explanation for the bond and the cash withdrawal. When the detectives asked him where the $7,000 went, Hal took them to the back of his truck. Inside it was a bag that had $6,000, and the rest was in Hal's pocket. After interviews in Ohio, detectives cleared Hal and John Rogers as suspects in the Florida murders. In October 1989, lead detective John Capel discovered a crucial lead while going through a bulletin from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. The bulletin mentioned an assault on a 24-year-old Canadian woman off Madeira Beach that occurred on May 15, 1989, just 2 weeks before the Rogers women were murdered. The description of the attacker's bow matched the Rogers women were last seen in. Capel and another detective flew to Canada to interview the victim and became convinced that the same man responsible for the assault was likely involved in the Rogers murder. The Canadian woman had met a man named David Posner at 7 to 11 in Madeira Beach. He was older, had tipped windows on his dark-colored four-wheel drive vehicle, and claimed to own an aluminium company and lived in Bradenton. He offered to take her on a boat ride the next afternoon. When she arrived, her friend decided not to go, so she went alone. After a seemingly pleasant trip, the man's demeanor changed and he assaulted her. He threatened her, bound her with duct tape, and forced her to comply. When they returned to the shore, he even apologized for his actions. The woman was able to escape and provided the detectives with enough information to create a composite sketch of her attacker. Back in Florida, the detectives realized there was no individual named David Posner who matched the attacker's description. They decided to release the composite drawing and description of the man, his boat, and his vehicle to the public. This resulted in 400 tips pouring in, leading to a surge of activity in the investigation. However, despite their efforts, none of the leads seemed to pan out, and the case hit another dead end. As time passed, the number of detectives assigned to the case dwindled. Nearly 6 months after the murders on December 23, 1989, the case seemed all but forgotten until Sergeant Glenn Moore took charge. Though lacking homicide experience, Moore refused to let the case fade away. He sought to reinvigorate the investigation, hoping to finally identify and apprehend the elusive suspect responsible for the heinous crimes. In October 1990, Joe and Steffi, a Tampa resident, saw a newspaper clipping of a composite drawing related to an assault case in Madeira Beach. She believed the sketch resembled one of her neighbors, a man who had recently moved in the area with his family. Despite feeling uneasy about him, Steffi hesitated to report her suspicions to the police, fearing involvement in the investigation. Later, during a chance encounter with a Hillsborough County Sheriff's deputy in her accounting class, Steffi confided in him about her neighbor's resemblance to the composite drawing. She asked the deputy to pass along the information without revealing her identity, hoping to remain uninvolved. Unfortunately, the tip somehow did not reach Sergeant Glenn Moore and his team, who were working on the Rogers murders case. They were overwhelmed with numerous tips and decided to utilize a new software called Holmes to organize their information better. They also sought assistance from the FBI's behavioral unit in Quantico. During this time, they interviewed Hal Rogers again and questioned around 70 people in Ohio to gain insights into the emotional states of Joe Rogers and her daughters. Meanwhile, a local newspaper, the Tribune, published an article pointing suspicions toward Hal Rogers, leading investigators to put Hal through a polygraph test to clear his name. After Hal passed the test, Sergeant Moore held a press conference to affirm that Hal was never a suspect but a victim in the case. It was 1991, around a year and a half passed since Joe and Steffi had shared her suspicions with the sheriff's deputy, but there had been no action taken yet. The man she found suspicious had already moved away with his family, having hardly interacted with others despite being amiable with people around him. The investigation into the Rogers murders continued, with Sergeant Moore sharing information received from Quantico during a press conference. Steffi's tip remained unaddressed as she wondered if the police were conducting background checks on the man she suspected. But again, gradually the case's progress was getting slower and slower. It was the spring of 1992. It had now been 3 years since the investigation started. The investigators had received 1,500 tips in this time, but still were nowhere close to identifying the assailant. However, they made progress in profiling the killer, concluding it was the work of a single man, based on the way the hands and legs were tied. They suspected that the person who gave directions to the Rogers family was the same individual who later lured them out. A distinctive handwriting on the directions prompted them to conduct a handwriting test. Sergeant Moore announced the new theory at a press conference, suggesting that the killers were likely charming, likable, and appeared respectable and harmless. Back in March 1992, Joe and Steffi's sister called the police to say that Steffi knew a man who resembled the suspect's sketches. The police tried to reach Steffi, but they couldn't get through. On May 14, 1992, it had almost been 2.5 years since Steffi had tipped the police about her neighbor. Now Steffi saw the news and Sergeant Moore's press conference in the newspaper and wondered if she should report her suspicion again. Steffi recalled her former neighbor, who was an aluminium contractor, and thought his handwriting might match the one in the composite sketch. She talked to Eileen Prisbys, a civilian investigator, about her neighbor, whose name was Oba Chandler in the contract, his boat, and his SUV. She found the contract in check from when Chandler built a port for her neighbor, Moselle Smith. Steffi compared the handwriting from the contract and the press conference clipping, and she was convinced it was the same. Steffi called the task force again and told Prisbys about the contract and handwriting. She wanted to provide a lead. They faxed the contract and check to the investigators, but the task force was dealing with a flood of tips, so it took time to look into Steffi's information, among the other leads. Meanwhile, the investigators used billboards to seek public help in finding the killer. Joe and Steffi and Moselle Smith had already shared their suspicions, but there was a backlog of tips. Frustrated, they sent the handwriting samples again, which now caught the attention of the task force. Investigator Prisbys reevaluated the writing, but couldn't make a definite match. The lead was handed to another investigator, J.J. Gogan, to follow up. On Friday, July 31st, Gogan visited Moselle Smith in Tampa to obtain the original contract related to Oba Chandler. Upon comparing the contract's handwriting with the directions on the brochure, the task force found strong similarities, leading them to consider Oba Chandler as a new suspect. They quickly gathered more information about him, discovering he was a 45-year-old man living with his family in Port Orange near Daytona Beach. Oba Chandler became a significant suspect in the investigation of the Rogers women's murders. At the time of the murders, he lived on Dalton Avenue, close to where Joe and the girls vanished, just 2 miles from the boat ramp. Records showed that he owned a 21-foot Bayliner boat with a blue and white interior and a dark blue Jeep Cherokee. He had an extensive criminal history, including charges of kidnapping, burglary, armed robbery, and counterfeiting. They compared a picture of Chandler with a composite sketch, and it was a perfect match. After 3 years of relentless investigation, Sergeant Moore was convinced they had their man. Another fact emerged. The man who had assaulted the Canadian woman before also owned an aluminium company, similar to Chandler's line of work as an aluminium contractor. To keep his real name hidden and avoid alerting Chandler, they referred to him as the Tin Man. The task force expanded rapidly, collaborating with the state attorney's office to build a strong case against Chandler. Chandler had a troubled past, with a history of crimes and a penchant for frightening and threatening people. Investigators spread across Florida and the Midwest collecting evidence against him. Born on October 11, 1946, in Cincinnati, Oba Jr. had a tumultuous childhood with his father taking his own life when he was young. He got into trouble early on, stealing cars and facing numerous arrests. As an adult, he faced a long list of charges, including possession of counterfeit money and armed robbery. Chandler married Deborah Ann Whiteman on May 14, 1988, just 10 days after she had divorced her husband. They bought a house on Dalton Avenue, close to Joe and Steffi, who later reported her suspicions about Chandler. Chandler's house had a canal leading to Tampa Bay, where he had a 21-foot bay liner boat during the time of the Rogers murders. He sold the boat shortly after the crimes. He also owned a dark blue Jeep Cherokee during the same period, resembling the vehicle described by the Canadian tourist who was assaulted. Investigators had now gathered enough evidence to consider Oba Chandler as the prime suspect in the Rogers women's murders. In the summer of 1990, as news about the Rogers investigation and its upcoming feature on Unsolved Mysteries spread, Chandler, his wife, and young daughter Whitney left their home on Dalton Avenue. They stopped making mortgage payments, leading the bank to foreclose and sell the house. Chandler moved to Florida's East Coast in July 1990, initially living in Broward County before settling in Port Orange near Daytona Beach. Despite his credit issues, by October 1991, he leased a house in his daughter's name. Chandler appeared normal to his neighbors, although they didn't know what he did for a living. Now, in 1992, investigators confirmed his handwriting and fingerprints matched evidence from the case, leading to surveillance of his new home with phone monitoring. In early September 1992, while other tasks were ongoing, 2 investigators, Detective Katie Connor-Dubina and FDLE agent John Halliday, traveled to Toronto to speak with the Canadian tourist who had been assaulted at the Madeira Beach in May 1989, just 2 weeks before the murders. The woman, now 27 and married, worked as a social worker. They showed her 6 pictures of different men and asked her to identify the person involved in the incident. When she saw the 3rd photo, she became visibly upset and confirmed that this was her assaulter. The photograph featured Oba Chandler. She signed the photo and asked to turn it over as it was disturbing her. A large team of about 40 to 50 law enforcement officers from various agencies, including the St. Petersburg Police, FDLE, and the FBI, were now surveilling Chandler around the clock. They had a command post near his house with a video camera monitoring his driveway. Whenever Chandler left, multiple unmarked cars followed him, carefully rotating to avoid being noticed. The FBI provided 2 small planes that took turns tracking Chandler from above, ensuring they never lost sight of him. They communicated with the ground units using the radio, saying, "Eagle has the eyeball." After setting up surveillance, prosecutors arrived in Volusia County with an arrest warrant for Chandler on the charges of assault. Investigators planned to question him, showing photos of the victim to prompt him to talk to the FBI's Daytona Beach office. It was Thursday, September 17th, 1992, the day that police had planned to question Chandler. That morning, just before Chandler was to be arrested, an unexpected event took place. As Chandler left his house in his blue Toyota Corolla, the surveillance teams debated whether to arrest him immediately or continue following him. They decided to keep trailing him, hoping he'd lead them to something significant. Chandler drove for a long time, and when he reached Lake City, the officers faced difficulties due to low fuel in the plane and a thunderstorm. They lost sight of Chandler in the heavy rain, and panic set in. They searched frantically but couldn't find him. Frustration and anger spread amongst the investigators, wondering if they missed their chance. They had to wait, monitoring Chandler's home, hoping he would return. Meanwhile, mysterious calls from Cincinnati and northern Kentucky added to the tension. The fear of Chandler potentially harming someone else haunted them. After losing Chandler for a week, the investigators received a call from Georgia, indicating he was returning. On September 24, 1992, they planned to arrest him without wasting any more time. Police waited for him on the I-95, but he took a different route. At a gas station in Port Orange, officers surrounded his car and arrested him for assault and battery. Back at the FBI office, they tried to make him talk, but he remained calm and asked for a lawyer. On the drive back to Pinellas County, Chandler talked casually with an FBI agent, even offering to provide information about a car scheme. The agent couldn't believe his audacity. Despite Chandler's complaints, his handcuffs remained secure. The next morning, Chandler had his initial hearing in a small courtroom at the Pinellas County Jail. The judge read the affidavit and kept bail at $1 million. Investigators found Chandler's blue and white Bayliner boat with a yellow Volvo engine. Inside his house in Port Orange, they discovered a mint green mesh shirt. The Canadian woman and her friend identified Chandler in a lineup. One of Chandler's many children, Crystal Mays, revealed that he visited her in 1989, admitting he was on the run for assault and possible killings. Her husband, Rick Mays, said Chandler confessed to assaulting women in his boat and throwing one overboard, mentioning he had murdered 3 women. With this new evidence, Chandler was indicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder in November, but the trial would not take place for another 2 years. It was the spring of 1994, several months before the trial was scheduled to begin. The prosecution now had access to Chandler's phone bills. While studying the bills, they noticed something strange. On May 15, 1989 and June 2, 1989, several collect calls were made to Chandler's house at specific times, 5:49 p.m. and 1:12 a.m., 1:30 a.m., 1:38 a.m., 8:11 a.m., and 9:52 a.m., respectively. All these calls were traced back to a special billing number, 813-223-0000, used for marine phone calls. The prosecution wanted to know who made these calls. They discovered that the calls had to be made through a marine phone operator, but unfortunately the records were destroyed. After persistent efforts, they found backup copies and were astonished to see that the May 15th call was made from a boat named Gypsy One, with the caller identifying himself as Oba. The June 2nd calls were also from Gypsy One, with the 5th call identifying the person as Obi. On September 19, 1994, Chandler's trial began. During the trial, the prosecution acted swiftly, calling around 20 witnesses each day. They presented evidence like the directions found on the brochure in Joe Rogers' car, the palm print on the brochure, and Chandler's call from his boat. Chandler's daughter Crystal Mays testified about his shocking confession in Cincinnati, where he admitted to physical assault and possibly murder. In jail, too, witnesses had heard himself incriminate himself, talking about assaulting a foreign woman and mentioning the Rogers case. A laborer, Rollins Cooper, shared how Chandler spoke about a date with 3 women on the day of the disappearance. The Canadian tourist bravely testified about her terrifying encounter with Chandler. Hal Rogers, Michelle's husband, remained strong in court, thanking the brave Canadian woman. In a crowded courtroom, Chandler testified in his defense, appearing calm and composed. He confirmed meeting the Rogers family when they asked for directions to Days Inn in Tampa. He thought they meant a different one at first, but one of the girls clarified and directed them toward Rocky Point. Chandler explained that he was returning from a job estimate when he encountered them at a gas station near Interstate 4 in East Tampa. During his testimony, Oba Chandler denied any involvement in the murders and refuted allegations made by witnesses. He explained a fishing trip gone wrong on the night of June 1, 1989. After finishing fishing that night, Chandler encountered a problem with his boat. He attempted to start the engine, but it only sputtered briefly before stopping. Investigating further, he noticed a strong smell of gas and found that a fuel hose had burst, causing the entire 40-gallon tank to leak into the space beneath the boat's deck. Scott Hopkins, the investigator, noticed something odd in Chandler's testimony about the fuel leak in his boat. Knowing the boat well, Hopkins was certain Chandler was lying. He immediately informed the lead prosecutor during the lunch break, and a mechanic was sent to reinvestigate Chandler's boat. After the lunch break, the prosecutor wasted no time in beginning the cross-examination. Chandler reluctantly admitted to his past felony convictions, and the prosecutor pushed him about the murder accusations made by his daughter and son-in-law, to which Chandler invoked the Fifth Amendment. The prosecutors then questioned the events of June 1, 1989, and exposed contradictions in Chandler's story about the fuel leak and his whereabouts. Evidence revealed that Chandler had made calls from the water before getting help, challenging his claims of being at a different location. The prosecutor also confronted Chandler about his escape to Cincinnati after the composite drawing of the Madeira Beach suspect was released. Chandler tried to downplay his fear, but the prosecutor implied they might have found their suspect. During a crucial moment, the prosecution team informed the lead prosecutor of a breakthrough regarding Chandler's boat. The mechanic had returned after checking the boat. Armed with this information, he cornered Chandler, asking about the broken fuel line. Springfield, Oregon is a charming town tucked away in the breathtaking landscapes of the Pacific Northwest. Just a stone's throw from Eugene, Springfield has carved out its own identity by becoming the beloved sister city that never quite outgrew its small-town charm. And here's an exciting tidbit. Legend has it that Springfield served as the inspiration for the iconic American town featured in The Simpsons. As you wander through the streets, you'll encounter the coolest murals splashed across various walls. Despite this colorful backdrop, the crime in Springfield today surpasses the national average. However, back in the 80s, the occurrence of violent crimes in this region was unheard of. Therefore, when a mother of her 3 children were attacked in this very place, people were left stunned. It still stands as one of the most unsettling tales to have ever unfolded within the city's borders. At approximately 10:48 p.m. on Thursday, May 19, 1983, 27-year-old Diane Downs arrived at the Mackenzie Willamette Hospital ER. The mother pointed towards her red Nissan sports car and screamed out loud, "Somebody shot my kids!" 8-year-old Christine and 3-year-old Danny were struggling to breathe as they lay in the back seat gasping for air. Meanwhile, 7-year-old Cheryl was lying face down on the floorboard in front, nearly hidden beneath the dashboard, covered by a dark sweater. In a race against time, all 3 children were rushed to the emergency room. The mother, Diane, had a minor gunshot wound to her left forearm, which was wrapped in a towel, a surprisingly minor injury considering the viciousness of the attack. Her children, however, were in critical condition. They had been shot multiple times at close range. Dr. Stephen Wilhite, one of the few board-certified thoracic surgeons in the hospital that night, rushed to the hospital after hearing about the tragic incident. Christine bore the brunt of 3 gunshot wounds, with 2 striking her left chest and 1 affecting her thumb. Due to immense blood loss, she had suffered a stroke. Danny had suffered a gunshot wound to his spine, resulting in paralysis. Although barely, both of them managed to hold on to life. Unfortunately, that was not the case for the other sibling, Cheryl, who had sustained 2 gunshot wounds to her back and was pronounced dead later that night. When news of Cheryl's death reached Diane, her demeanor was calm, a little too calm. She did not even flinch after hearing that the other 2 children had survived after being grievously injured. Her sole inquiry was whether the bullet had missed Danny's heart. The lack of visible emotional response from Diane struck those around her as odd, to say the least. It was difficult for them to fathom how a mother who had just lost one child and found the other two in critical condition could appear so seemingly detached and unaffected. However, the medical professionals attending to her wounds speculated that Diane might be experiencing shock, a common response to such a distressing incident. Understanding the gravity of the situation, the hospital didn't waste any time in alerting the around 11:15 p.m. 3 officers from the Lane County Sheriff's Office, Dick Tracy, Doug Welch, and Roy Pond arrived at the hospital. Once Diane's initial treatment was complete, she was seated for an interview with the detectives. They began the interview with an introduction and then moved on to ask Diane about the events that had transpired throughout the day, seeking her first-hand account. Diane proceeded to tell the investigators that she left the kids at her parents' house at around 6:15 a.m. before heading off to work at approximately 6:30 a.m. Christy and Cheryl attended school, while Diane's mother looked after Danny. After school ended, the girls joined their younger brother at their grandparents' home. Diane said she got off work at around 3:30 p.m. and went to her parents' house to pick up the kids. She returned to their rental duplex at 1352 Q Street with her children to have supper. But then there would be an unusual change in their otherwise ordinary routine. Diane had a friend named Heather Pollard, who resided outside of Springfield on Sunderman Road. She explained that Heather had previously expressed an interest in owning a horse to her, so when Diane had come across an article about horses available for adoption, she thought Heather might find it appealing. Since the Pollard family did not have a phone, Diane, accompanied by her children, decided to pay them a visit that night. They stayed at the Pollard property approximately 15 to 20 minutes, during which Diane engaged in conversation with Heather while her kids had the opportunity to feed and interact with the horse on the farm. Diane said they left around 9:15 p.m. On their way back home, Cheryl occupied the front passenger seat, with Danny sitting directly behind her in the back seat, and Christy seated next to him, behind the passenger seat, instead of taking the direct route back home. Impulsively, Diane made a spur-of-the-moment decision to indulge in a bit of sightseeing, something she claimed both she and the children enjoyed doing. However, after doing this for a while, she turned back towards Springfield, noticing all 3 children had fallen asleep. She was driving down Old Mohawk Road, outside the city, and Duran Duran's Hungry Like a Wolf was playing on the stereo. Diane said she only drove for a short distance on that dark country road when she encountered a man in the middle of the road. Diane proceeded to tell the detectives that the man pushed her toward the back of the vehicle and then put his hand into the open car window. The next thing she heard was the loud popping sounds, which were directed toward Cheryl first, followed by Danny and finally Christy. He then turned to Diane and once again demanded the car. Diane further continued that she mustered up the courage to fight back, realizing that her children had been shot. After Diane managed to escape in her car, she noticed that her children were bleeding profusely. While Christy was choking on her own blood, Danny was moaning in pain, but Cheryl didn't make any noise the whole time. Diane said she drove as fast as she could, but her own gunshot wound was causing her pain. So at some point she tightly wrapped a towel from her wrist to her elbow to slow the flow of blood. Just like the hospital workers, the detectives couldn't help but notice Diane's seemingly detached demeanor throughout the interview. Despite the gravity of the situation and the tragic events that had unfolded, she didn't display the expected emotional response. Instead, she remained composed, not shedding a tear and even laughing at certain points. While it is true that shock and grief can manifest differently in individuals, the detectives sensed that something wasn't adding up. Diane even went on to say that she prayed for their deaths to spare them from the suffering. There were more red flags. Who goes sightseeing in the dark with 3 young children in the car? Why would someone stop the car and interact with a suspicious individual on a deserted road? And which mother would prioritize tending to her own wound with a towel while her kids were bleeding to death? The hospital workers also shared some of the disturbing comments made by Diane upon her arrival at the hospital. She reportedly made remarks such as, "Boy, this has really spoiled my vacation. And that really ruined my new car. I got blood all over the back of it." These comments were not only bizarre but also deeply troubling, making everyone question the credibility of her story. Despite this, the investigators wanted to give the benefit of the doubt to a grieving mother, so they did not yet rule out the possibility of an unknown perpetrator. Their attention shifted towards gathering more information about the perpetrator, whom Diane had described to them. The police swiftly issued an APB for the bushy-haired stranger, a term Diane had never used, but it summarized her description. Ironically, in law enforcement, the term bushy-haired stranger is used to refer to a person who does not exist and cannot be produced in a court of law. It serves as a cover-up alibi figure for the guilty party to falsely attribute their crimes to. Nonetheless, a composite sketch was made based on Diane's description and was widely circulated to the media. Unfortunately, no witnesses or individuals who had seen the alleged perpetrator or his vehicle came forward to provide significant leads or breakthroughs in the investigation. But as word went out about this horrific tragedy, residents of Springfield were left in a state of shock and fear. The idea that a violent and ruthless individual had targeted innocent children and their mother left people on edge. Children were no longer allowed to alone. Mothers in particular refrained from going out in the evening with their children. The safety and security of the people of Springfield became a paramount concern. Amidst the chaos, authorities continued their investigation. A comprehensive search of the entire area was conducted, which led to a significant discovery. Ejected casings from a spent .22 caliber firearm, the casings matched the bullet wounds inflicted on the members of Downs' family. Investigators at this point didn't have a lot to go on, though they had their suspicions about Diane. They basically did not have any evidence to establish her guilt. That was when they came up with an idea. For the most part, reenactments are not easy for the victims, especially when they have experienced the loss of their loved ones. It is expected that most people would be overwhelmed with emotion and may cry while reenacting the most terrible moments of their lives. However, it was Diane Downs whose reenactment video would forever be remembered as one of the most disturbing ones in history. Alarmingly, not only was she seen giggling and joking, but she was even filmed fixing her makeup during the reenactment. It was enough to make the investigators' hair stand on end. Investigators knew that in order to understand this strange woman and piece together the case, they needed to delve deeper into her personal life. Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson, who went by her middle name, was born on August 7, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona, to her parents Wesley Lyndon Fredrickson and Willa Dean Fredrickson. Diane would grow up in what appeared to be the typical American family of the 1950s and 1960s, with her 3 younger brothers and 1 younger sister. Although Diane excelled at her studies, she was not at all popular in school. In fact, throughout her education, she was picked on by the other children, mostly because she came from a family with strict conservative values, and her parents forbade her to wear fashionable clothes or makeup. In her early years, Diane was a shy child, but that changed when she reached the age of 14, and she developed a tendency to talk compulsively. Diane graduated from Moon Valley High School in Phoenix, where she encountered her high school sweetheart, Stephen Downs, when she was just 15 years old. Despite her parents' disapproval, Diane continued the relationship with Steve, who was just 7 months older than her. They stayed together for the remainder of high school, but their path diverged when Steve enlisted in the Navy in June 1972. After high school, Diane enrolled at Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College, located in Orange, California. However, her time at college was short-lived, as she was expelled after just 1 year due to alleged promiscuous behavior. Following her expulsion, Diane had no choice but to return to her parents' home in Arizona. Diane had a stifling atmosphere at home, as her parents constantly tried to clip her wings. Desperate to break free from the confines of her home life, she reconciled with Steve, eventually marrying him in November 1973. Diane was just 18 at the time. From the very beginning, their marriage was shaky at best. Additionally, the couple frequently fought over financial matters and accused each other of being unfaithful. Diane craved love and attention, only to discover Steve could not provide it. Diane found solace when she became pregnant, despite the ongoing problems in her marriage. Surprisingly, she didn't consult Stephen about getting pregnant. She just stopped using her birth control, and she didn't regret the decision. Diane relished being pregnant, as it seemed to earn her the love and attention she had always desired. In October 1974, Diane gave birth to her first child, Christie. A pregnancy only lasted for a few months, and once it ended, Diane missed the attention she used to receive. So she once again stopped using birth control without informing her husband. As a result, Cheryl Lynn, their second child, was born in January 1976. But as much as she enjoyed being pregnant, she did not derive the same pleasure from actually raising her children. According to Steve Downs, Diane would frequently neglect her children. Their fights would sometimes lead her to take the kids and run away from Steve, but she always returned eventually. After Cheryl's birth, Steve made the decision that he didn't want any more children. He couldn't trust his wife with birth control, so he opted for a vasectomy. However, despite this procedure, Diane ended up getting pregnant again, but she chose to terminate the pregnancy. In 1978, the couple relocated to Mesa, Arizona. It was there that Diane engaged in multiple affairs with her coworkers. One such affair with one of her male friends, Mark Sager, resulted in becoming pregnant once again. This time she decided to carry the child to term, and in December 1979, Stephen Danny Daniel was born. A final attempt to salvage their marriage, Stephen accepted Danny as his own, even though he knew he wasn't the father. Yet less than a year later they got divorced. The children stayed with their mother. When the marriage ended, Diane didn't have a stable job. In her attempt to support herself, she pursued becoming a surrogate mother, but faced setbacks. She failed 2 psychiatric exams, one of which indicated that she was psychotic. Rather than being concerned, Diane found this amusing and would boast about it to her friends. In 1981, Diane finally secured a full-time job as a postal carrier in Chandler, Arizona. During her working hours, she would send her children to stay with various family members. However, concerns were raised by neighbors about the well-being of the children when they were in their mother's care. According to the neighbors, the children would often be hungry and would beg for food. In cold weather, they would not be adequately dressed in coats or suitable shoes. It was reported that if Diane couldn't find a babysitter, she would leave her 6-year-old daughter, Christine, in charge of the other children. One neighbor even mentioned that Cheryl had expressed fear of her own mother. Despite the alleged negligence of her own children, later in the same year, Diane was finally accepted into a surrogate program. In May 1982, Diane gave birth to a girl named Jennifer and surrendered her to her parents in exchange for $10,000. In February of 1983, just a few months before the shooting incident, Diane returned to Springfield, Oregon to be closer to her parents. Despite the relocation, she maintained her employment as a postal worker. Despite Diane's unstable life, nobody could have anticipated the tragedy that would engulf her family just months later. As the investigation into Diane's past unfolded, she seemed to develop a newfound interest in giving interviews. It was evident that Diane enjoyed being in the spotlight and the attention that came with it. Within a few days of the tragic incident, she eagerly gave multiple interviews appearing with full hair and makeup. She would retell her story over and over, emphasizing her pain while frequently downplaying her children's fate. She made this claim even after knowing that the bullet had caused significant damage to his spine and posed a risk of permanent paralysis. Diane may have intended to elicit sympathy from the public through these interviews, but it just had the opposite effect. Instead of garnering support, her behavior and demeanor during the interview began to raise suspicion and doubt among viewers. People noted instances where she appeared to laugh or make light of the gruesome details of that fateful night. These actions, along with the inconsistencies in her narrative, caused public opinion to shift, viewing Diane less as a grieving mother and more as a potential perpetrator. As Diane noticed the shift in public perception, she attempted to counter the growing suspicion by posting contrasting questions. What Diane didn't know was that there was one person who had witnessed the truth she had so desperately tried to cover up. Joseph Inman was behind Diane's car that night and saw something that completely contradicted Diane's story. Diane's story didn't make sense from the start. After all, what would a stranger have to gain by shooting the children? If he had wanted the car, he could have just shot her, the only adult present at the scene, and taken the car. Furthermore, the forensic evidence pointed towards a different scenario. Bloodstains were found on the side door of the front seat, where Cheryl had been shot, and on the rear seat where Danny and Christine had been hit, but there was no blood on the driver's side. If Diane had been shot as she described, it would be expected for her to instinctively grab the wound with her other hand, resulting in blood being present on her hand and the steering wheel. Additionally, the location of the gunpowder residue indicated that the shooter was likely seated in the driver's seat, casting further doubt on Diane's account. However, there was one interview that Diane Downs would give in November 1983 that would send shockwaves throughout the nation. People couldn't believe the level of narcissism displayed during the interview with reporter and Yeager for Kezi News. In a shocking audacity, she even stated that her kids were luckier than her and made jokes about it. Needless to say, it was a surreal experience for the viewers as they witnessed firsthand the depths of Diane's self-centeredness and lack of empathy. The lack of trust and suspicion surrounding Diane Downs went far beyond the media and law enforcement. Diane's own father casted doubts on her account and must have taken him an immense amount of courage to say this about his own daughter. But he too could not shake off the feeling that something didn't sit right. But the case against Diane Downs was still weak. All the evidence was circumstantial. The disturbing behavior exhibited by her and the inconsistencies in her story were not sufficient to directly establish her guilt in the crime. The case hinged on the other two witnesses, Christy and Danny. Unfortunately, Danny, being only 3 years old at the time of the attack, was too young to remember any significant information about the incident. This left Christy as the potential key witness. However, Christy's ability to communicate was severely impacted due to the stroke she suffered. Although there was hope, no one was sure if she would ever be able to speak normally. Yet every time her mother entered the room, Christy's eyes glazed over with apparent fear and her heart rate significantly increased. In light of the overall circumstances and the need to ensure the safety and well-being of the children, the state made the decision to remove custody from Diane. It was determined that the children would be placed into foster care once they were released from the hospital. With each passing day, Diane became increasingly careless and overconfident in her demeanor. She even went as far as challenging the police to arrest her, as she firmly believed they did not have enough evidence to incriminate her. At the same time, the police were still grappling with the lack of a clear motive for the murder. The strongest forensic evidence they had was the 22 bullet shells discovered at the crime scene, but the absence of a murder weapon hindered their progress. Faced with limited leads, detectives decided to visit Diane's apartment in the hopes of finding any additional clues. The first notable piece of evidence that the detectives found at Diane's home was a diary. It served as a treasure trove of information about Diane's life after she had moved to Chandler in 1982. While working as a postal carrier, Diane involved herself in multiple affairs with married co-workers. One of them, however, would alter the course of her life permanently. In July 1982, Diane Downs began an affair with Robert Knickerbocker, a fellow co-worker who was married to a woman named Charlene. At the time, he was having problems with Charlene and was looking for a distraction. Diane never meant anything more than a fling to him, and he had no intention of leaving his wife. However, to Diane, he was her greatest love. In her diary, Diane mentioned how she never loved anybody more than she loved Nick, her affectionate nickname for him. She fantasized about building a life and starting a family with him. She was so interested in him that she rented an apartment and even got a tattoo of a large rose with his name beneath it. That was not the case with Nick. Throughout the 9 months of their affair, Nick's commitment wavered between Diane and his wife Charlene. In February of 1983, Diane's pursuit of Nick reached a breaking point. She began pressuring him to divorce his wife, and he finally confessed that he loved his wife, Charlene, more than he loved Diane. He also made it clear that he had no desire to have children, and he didn't intend to become the stepfather to her children either. In an attempt to manipulate the situation, Diane requested a transfer from Chandler to Springfield, Oregon, where her parents lived. She believed that this move would intimidate Nick and make him run back to her. She even asked her father, Wes, who also worked for the Postal Service, to help Nick find a job in Oregon. However, once Diane left Arizona, Nick gained clarity and realized that he didn't want to move to Springfield or be with Diane. He decided to stay with his wife and refused Diane's mail and calls, marking the definitive end of their relationship. Despite the end of their relationship in April of 1983, Diane's infatuation with Nick continued to consume her thoughts and writings. She expressed her longings for him, both physically and emotionally, even after everything she held onto the hope that he would eventually come back to her. Surprisingly or not surprisingly, her lingering feelings for Nick did not stop her from sleeping with other men, beginning just 7 days after her arrival in Springfield. When the police searched her home, they found that Diane had kept 2 of Nick's pictures with her own pictures on top of the television. But there were no pictures of the kids. The detectives made an observation that Diane seldom wrote about her children, Christy, Cheryl, and Danny in her diary. The majority of her diary entries revolved around Nick. However, on May 11, 1983, just 8 days before the shootings, Diane's focus abruptly shifted. It was as if she had suddenly rediscovered her children and started describing them as fantastic, smart, and sweet. She portrayed her family as a tight-knit group, referring to themselves as the Four Musketeers, and expressing a newfound love for them that supposedly surpassed feelings for Nick. Investigators believed that at this point, Diane had already made plans to kill him. It was not just another red flag. The detectives believed they had finally found the motive for the crime. According to them, Diane saw her children as thorns in her side. She believed that removing her children from the picture would make her become more appealing to Nick, and that he would then be willing to provide emotional support and comfort in the aftermath of the tragic event. It wasn't the only incriminating evidence police found at Diane's home. They also found a few on-fire .22 caliber shell casings with extractor markings. When detectives asked Diane if she owned any .22 caliber firearms, she denied this vehemently. But both Steve Downs and Robert Knickerbocker confirmed that she did in fact own one such firearm. The detectives approached Nick and requested his assistance in obtaining a confession from Diane. By exploiting her weakness towards him, he agreed to cooperate and made a few calls to Diane. During the call, Diane primarily focused on her own experiences and emotions, particularly her physical pain and the need for emotional support. Yet she failed to express concern about the well-being of her surviving children. In one call, Nick told Diane that he didn't believe her story. Whether Robert Knickerbocker was worth murder to Diane Downs or not, she did not confess to the crime. At this point, detectives were no longer playing on the surface. They confronted her directly and made it clear that she was the primary focus of their investigation. Realizing that sarcasm wouldn't save her, Diane changed her story. She claimed that there was no bushy-haired stranger, but instead it was 2 men wearing ski masks who attacked her and her children. According to Diane, the men knew her as they called her by name. Throughout a 2-hour period, the detectives relentlessly probed her for the truth, and as they neared the conclusion, her frustration reached a boiling point. The tape ended with Diane storming out of the sheriff's office, unable to put up with the questions. A month passed after the shooting. The pressure was mounting on law enforcement to make an arrest. By the beginning of 1984, police had gathered all the evidence pointing towards the prime suspect, Diane. However, they eagerly awaited Christy's recovery, as she was the only person who could provide them with a first-hand account of what truly transpired. Christy's healing process was slow but steady, and she eventually regained her ability to speak. Despite her initial fear, with the help of therapists working tirelessly with her for months, Christy mustered the courage to eventually reveal the truth. It was a truth that would put an end to all the speculations surrounding the case. Confirming what many had already suspected, Christy unequivocally declared that her own mother, Diane Downs, was the one who shot her and her siblings on that fateful night. On February 28, 1984, nearly 9 months after the shooting, Diane was finally arrested. Diane pleaded not guilty to all charges, and thus the case proceeded to trial. However, Diane Downs was not one to go down so easily. When her trial commenced in June 1984, she shocked the nation by appearing visibly pregnant, leaving everyone speechless. As it turned out, back in October of 1983, while working as a postal carrier, Diane seduced a young teacher and ended up becoming pregnant. Diane said she felt lonely without her children. The prosecution, however, saw it as Diane's way of gaining sympathy. The trial of Diane Downs became a national spectacle, with hundreds of people lining up each day in hopes of securing a seat in the courtroom. Though cameras were not allowed inside the courtroom, the media closely followed the trial. The jury was comprised of 9 women and 3 men. The trial lasted a month. The prosecutor, Fred Hugie, had a solid case against Diane. The evidence against Diane appeared insurmountable. Along with the bullet casings and blood spatter, Hugie called upon a number of witnesses, including Heather Plord, Joseph Inman, Stephen Downs, and Robert Knickerbocker. They all testified against Diane. Defense attorney Jim Jagger made every effort to present Diane Downs' version of events, emphasizing the involvement of a bushy-haired stranger. Diane herself took the stand and reiterated her story, staunchly maintaining her innocence. However, she struggled to provide a convincing explanation for the inconsistencies in her account. Diane also testified that she had been physically abused by her father on multiple occasions, which impacted her future decisions, a disturbing claim that Diane's family denied. The jury viewed this claim as a lie intended to invoke sympathy, and Diane's family denied the allegations as well. The most anticipated witness of this trial was Christine Downs. With utmost bravery, then 9-year-old Christy, still suffering with a speech impediment, took the stand to recount the night of May 19, 1983. Christie's recollection of the events on May 19, 1983 was vivid and haunting. She remembered the moments leading up to the shooting. Let us travel back to October 22, 1984, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the city was left in disbelief as 18-year-old Annette Craver vanished without a trace. The police, determined to unravel the truth, scoured the area, but their efforts were in vain, and the whereabouts of the teenage married girl remained a haunting mystery. While the mystery of her disappearance loomed large, the police suspected that it wasn't just a simple disappearing act, but a terrifying case of homicide. This situation was considerably more twisted than initially apparent. A man was at the center of it all, and his twisted mindset would triumph over the quest for justice for an incredible 54 years, until justice finally succeeded. What could have happened to young Annette? Who was this psychopath? And why did it take so long to unravel the truth behind this haunting case? As we delve into this chilling case, we will also lead you through 2 other haunting mysteries intricately connected to this story. Tulsa, Oklahoma is a captivating city with a unique blend of modernity and tradition. Nestled in the heart of the United States, this metropolis offers a dynamic lifestyle enriched by its diverse cultural scene. Tulsa is renowned for its well-preserved Art Deco architecture, thriving performing arts scene, and mouth-watering Oklahoma-style barbecue joints. Additionally, the city holds fame for its significant history in oil production and proudly stands as the birthplace for the iconic Route 66. Despite its successes, Tulsa has had its struggles with crime. In 2020, the city's violent crime rate surpassed the national average, elevating it to one of the cities with some of the highest crime rates in the U.S. Adding to the city's darker side, Annette Craver's mysterious disappearance also occurred within Tulsa. Born on December 7, 1965, in Houston, Texas, Annette Michelle Craver's early years remained relatively shrouded in mystery. However, a significant turning point occurred when her father tragically lost his life in a car crash in 1979. The heartbreaking event took a toll on Annette's emotional well-being. Her mother, Mary Rose, observed a notable change in Annette's behavior, noting that she grew increasingly withdrawn and often sought solace in solitude. Deep within her heart, Mary held the understanding that her cherished daughter had been grappling with immense difficulties following the loss of her father. On September 8, 1981, a significant event occurred as Mary orchestrated a yard sale in Houston to part with her late husband's belongings. Annette, then 15 years old, actively assisted her mother in the sale. Despite her silence regarding her feelings, it was evident that Annette was far from having moved past the profound loss of her father. But Mary didn't realize that Annette wasn't actually feeling lonely. Unbeknownst to Mary, Annette had been involved with a man whose charm was coupled with a significant age gap. He was not only older than Annette, but even surpassed her mother's age. It was during the yard sale that Mary had her first encounter with Annette's friend, 40-year-old Felix Vale. As he approached Annette to engage in conversation, observing the notable age difference, Mary remained unsuspecting, never entertaining the notion that something more was going on. In the aftermath of Annette's father's demise, Mary grappled with the weight of financial hardships. The task of securing employment in Houston proved elusive, prompting her to consider relocating in pursuit of better opportunities to provide for her daughter. Following a series of challenges, Mary's determination bore fruit as she secured a job offer in the state of Oklahoma. However, a significant concern remained. Annette, who had already missed 2 years of school, was on the verge of graduating high school. Mary understood that relocating abruptly to a different state could jeopardize her daughter's academic process. Faced with this dilemma, Mary opted for a solution. She reached out to a friend seeking assistance in caring for Annette while she made the move to Oklahoma to secure employment. While the plan initially appeared sound, it soon began to unravel for Mary. As time passed, a growing concern emerged. Annette and Felix's relationship seemed to have intensified in her absence. Mary couldn't shake off her unease as she observed the 40-year-old man becoming increasingly intertwined in her underage daughter's life, a situation that deeply troubled her. After Annette's high school graduation, Mary's diligent savings allowed her to purchase a new house. With the dream of living together once again, she registered the house under both their names. However, upon her return to Houston, Mary discovered that Annette had already left. Dashing her hopes of a long-awaited reunion, Mary learned that when Annette graduated, Felix swiftly proposed a road trip to her, and captivated by his charm, she readily agreed to his proposal. Over time, in 1983, Mary did receive sporadic letters from Annette, each from a different location. Then, one day a call arrived from her daughter, who was then in California. Mary felt a surge of joy hearing from Annette, but the conversation soon took a stressful turn. Annette, who was just 17 back then, sought her mother's approval to marry Felix Vale. Knowing that there was a chance of losing her daughter, who was deeply involved with Felix, Mary struggled with the difficult choice that lay ahead. It was clear that saying no would come with its own consequences, yet arriving at a choice was far from straightforward. With a heavy heart, Mary ultimately made the difficult choice to allow Annette to marry Felix. However, the idyllic married life that Annette had envisioned would soon begin to crumble. Shortly after their marriage, Annette confided in her mother through heartfelt letters. She revealed that Felix had undergone a troubling transformation, turning increasingly controlling. Shockingly, she shared that Felix had even coerced her into undergoing an illegal abortion following her pregnancy with his child. Consumed by fear for her daughter's well-being, Mary implored Annette to return home without delay. Eventually, in 1984, Annette found the courage to break free from Felix's hold and found her way back to her mother. However, upon laying eyes on her daughter, Mary couldn't help but recognize that her beloved daughter had changed. Despite the heartbreak, Mary made attempts to mend the situation with Annette, but her efforts were in vain. Annette remained firmly under Felix's influence, impervious to any other perspective. Thus, with a heavy heart, Mary relinquished her share of the house, gathered her belongings, and moved to California. However, that was not the end of the nightmare. As Annette reached the age of 18, she took a significant step by accessing the inheritance left by her deceased father. Shockingly, she allegedly transferred all the funds into Felix's account and also transferred ownership of her house to his name. Upon learning of this alarming development, Mary wasted no time and immediately contacted Felix. On October 22, 1984, upon receiving the missing person report, the Tulsa police swiftly approached Felix Vale in an attempt to obtain any possible information. Regrettably, much like Annette, the police too fell victim to Felix's manipulation. Mary strongly suspected that Felix played a crucial part in Annette's disappearance and was hiding the truth. However, despite her convictions, the police were swayed by Felix's words, leading them to abandon the search for Annette Craver Vale. Left with no options, the mother found herself in a state of helplessness, clinging to a resolute belief that her daughter would one day return. By 1991, a staggering 7 years had elapsed with no breakthrough in locating Annette. Mary tried to reach out to the police by sending them hundreds of letters, but neither the police nor the FBI was interested in responding to her. Even the letters she sent to Felix were left unanswered. Mary came to the stark realization that relying on others would yield no results. Driven by her determination, she resolved to undertake an investigation on her own. Convinced that Felix held a key to Annette's disappearance, Mary initially attempted to gather information about him through the fledgling resources of the internet. Yet during the 1990s, online information was far from abundant. Through her unwavering research, Mary managed to secure a solitary but significant lead. Felix's sister, Sue Jordan. Fueled by hope and the prospect of uncovering crucial information, Mary embarked on a journey that spanned halfway across the country to meet with her. Armed with this darling revelation, Mary swiftly managed to trace the family of Felix's first wife, Mary Horton Vale, in Louisiana during 1993. Her efforts bore fruit as she successfully located Mary Horton's brother, Will Horton, who had been merely 15 years old at the time of his sister's tragic drowning in the Calcasieu River. During Mary's meeting with Will, he fondly recalled his sister as a kind and virtuous individual, speaking of her in glowing terms. However, the sentiment wasn't reciprocated when it came to his brother-in-law, Felix Vale. Will shared that the Horton family held a distinct resentment towards Felix. Born on February 16, 1940, in Eunice, Louisiana, Mary Elizabeth Horton Vale's roots trace back to the southern state. In 1957, she was crowned a Eunice High School homecoming queen and took on the role of the editor for the school newspaper. Her path crossed with Felix's when she was pursuing her education at McNeese State College in 1960. Remarkably, a mere 6 months after their initial meeting in July 1961, the two exchanged vows in marriage. Their union bore fruit, as in 1961, Mary welcomed a son into the world named Bill Vale. However, Felix had a different opinion. With the arrival of their baby, Felix's demeanor underwent a notable change. Similar to his later behavior with Annette, he adopted a controlling attitude towards his first wife. He even used threats, warning her of severe outcomes if she were to become pregnant again. Despite the warning, Mary Elizabeth Horton Vale found herself pregnant again the following year. The news incited a fierce anger within Felix, prompting her to seek refuge from his rage. Fearing his wrath, she retreated to her mother's home, accompanied by her son, Bill. October 28, 1962, marked a tragic event when Mary Horton and Felix Vale were engaged in fishing along the Calcasieu River. In an unfortunate twist of fate, Mary met her demise by drowning. When questioned by the police, Felix recounted his version of events. "We took the boat from the Calcasieu River near Lake Charles," he stated. While Mary was trawling, she shifted her position in the boat and accidentally fell overboard. However, the Horton family remained skeptical of this account, finding it hard to accept as the truth. Felix swiftly became the prime suspect in the case due to suspicious circumstances surrounding Mary's drowning. The location of her death was not suitable for fishing activities. Her body, discovered 2 days later, underwent an autopsy that revealed telltale signs. Bruising on her neck, right calf, and left leg indicated a possible struggle prior to her immersion in water. Further incriminating evidence emerged as authorities found a scarf wrapped around her neck and placed in her mouth, suggestive of traumatic asphyxia, a form of suffocation. Despite mounting evidence and all the detectives being sure that Felix was the murderer, the coroner had a totally different opinion. He believed that evidence was not enough to convict Felix. Moreover, Felix vehemently denied any guilt. In January 1963, a Calcasieu Parish grand jury failed to indict him, resulting in his release. As Will conveyed this information, breaking down in the process, Mary Rose was further inflamed by what she heard. Now, Mary Rose's pursuit extended beyond seeking justice solely for her daughter, Annette. It encompassed a resolute quest for justice on behalf of Will's sister, Mary Horton, as well. However, before justice could be obtained for the two women, and before the police could be fully engaged, Mary recognized the necessity for more tangible evidence beyond mere statements. Fortunately, she was no longer alone in her battle for justice. Upon understanding the complexities of Annette's story, Will gained a clear understanding of the situation and provided Mary with a particularly intriguing piece of information. Will disclosed to Mary that he had been receiving numerous calls since 1975, inquiring about a girl who had disappeared from Sulphur, Louisiana, in 1973. To compound the eeriness of the situation, the girl in question was none other than Sharon Hensley, who happened to be Felix's girlfriend after Mary Horton. Embarking on a new journey in her quest for information, Mary Rose now set her sights on a different destination. In 1994, she traveled to Bismarck, North Dakota to meet with Brian Hensley, Sharon's brother. Sharon Hensley, born on December 20th, 1948, left her home in Bismarck, North Dakota, during the summer of 1970, with dreams of peace and love. She aimed to embrace a new life, joining other free-spirited individuals who were shaping their journey in the wake of the famous Summer of Love. San Francisco beckoned as the ultimate destination for Hensley. She succeeded in reaching her goal. However, the reality that awaited her was a far cry from the picturesque existence she had envisioned in her North Dakota haven. Instead, her path led her to Felix Vale. During that time, following the passing of his first wife, Felix delved into a hippie lifestyle, embracing a transient existence. He even took on the role of a wandering preacher, and during this phase he established his own personal cult, known as the Holy Order of Mans. It was within this period that 21-year-old Sharon met Felix. 2 years after her departure in 1972, Sharon returned to her parents' home in Bismarck, accompanied by her new boyfriend, Felix Vale. However, something had changed in their daughter. The once energetic girl from North Dakota who enjoyed dancing and spending time with friends now appeared to be distant. Her independence seemed to be eclipsed by her new boyfriend's influence, much to her parents' concern. The meeting left her parents uneasy, but Sharon, being an adult, chose to depart with Felix. She held the autonomy to make her own decisions. Nonetheless, her parents' worries intensified. They held the belief that Felix was leading their daughter into a troubling lifestyle, one marked by drug use and reckless behavior. However, even they couldn't have foreseen what lay ahead in the future. Sharon soon became a member of the Holy Order of Mans, engaging with the group for a brief duration. However, her involvement coincided with a stark shift in circumstances. Felix's behavior underwent a transformation, turning increasingly violent and domineering while his drug consumption escalated progressively. Sharon was on the brink of departing for South America alongside Felix. However, before embarking on this journey, she made a final call to her mother to bid her farewell. Yet, her mother couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that something was amiss. After that last contact, no calls or letters arrived from Sharon. She vanished without a trace in 1973. Felix communicated with Sharon's family through a letter, asserting that he had last seen her in Key West. According to his account, she had left him and set out on a journey with an Australian couple to sail around the world. Yet, just as was the recurring theme in all these cases, the Hensley family had doubts regarding everything Felix said. Sharon's family filed a missing persons report in February 1973, but unfortunately the police did not take any action for an entire year. Even though there weren't immediate investigations or initial police support, an old newspaper report filled the gap. The old newspaper report piqued Brian Hensley's interest. The news article was from 1970, about an arrest report of Sharon and Felix. The report stated that a young boy around the age of 8 appeared at the police station, seeking assistance to be taken back to his home. The child turned out to be none other than Bill Vale, the son of Mary Horton and Felix Vale. The police discovered that without the knowledge of the Horton family, Felix had taken Bill with him when he left for California after Mary Horton's death. From that point on, Bill was compelled to accompany his troubled father wherever he went. The police also learned that Bill had suffered from violence during this time, until he managed to run away and find his way to the police station. Felix and Sharon were arrested for child endangerment. However, how the two got free is not known. Upon learning from Sharon's brother, Mary Rose resolved to meet with Bill Vale. She believed that Bill had valuable information about Felix's location, making him a potential source of crucial details. Driven by this intention, Mary embarked on a journey to Kansas to meet with Bill and his family. At first, Bill was hesitant to divulge extensive information, as he feared the sharing details might inadvertently bring Felix closer to his own wife and children. Nevertheless, his desire to assist Mary and secure justice for his mother prevailed. Bill recognized the significance of this opportunity and chose not to let it slip away. Building up some courage, he revealed the hidden secrets that could prove Mary right. Bill recounted a pivotal moment from 1970, just before he fled and reached the police station. He had inadvertently overheard a conversation between his father, Felix, and Sharon. Following the arrest of Sharon and Felix in 1970, Bill found refuge with his grandparents, which marked a significant transformation in his life. Despite this change, his fear of his father persisted, especially as he was compelled to testify against him in court during the trials. This anxiety heightened as he dreaded the possibility of his father's return. And tragically, Felix did reappear. In 1975, Felix came to Bill's residence asserting that he solely wanted to see his son. Bill was gripped by fear, but what made his fear stronger was the absence of Sharon, who was no longer with Felix. Bill grappled with the fear that Felix might inflict harm upon his family if he divulged these revelations. Yet his determination for justice was more powerful. Tragically, Bill's life was cut short by cancer in 2009, preventing him from witnessing the realization of justice for his mother. However, before his passing, Bill took meticulous steps to ensure his account of Felix's confession was documented. He engaged his local preacher to record his narrative, safeguarding the truth for posterity. After years of relentless investigation, Mary finally sensed that she possessed something substantial enough to urge the FBI to reopen the case. Even though she was aware of the absence of concrete physical evidence, she held on to the conviction that the collective testimony of the Hortons, Sharon's brother, Felix's son Bill, and herself could potentially provide the ammunition needed to fight for justice on behalf of her daughter. Tragically, the agent who'd shown belief in Mary's cause was let go due to budget constraints, and the cold case department bore the brunt of the cutbacks. This unfortunate turn of events left no avenue for Mary's request to be pursued. She found herself right back where she started. However, the families who had faith in her knew she would not stop. Meanwhile, Mary's resolve to fight for justice had taken a toll on her over the span of nearly 30 long years, gradually wearing her down. In June 2011, while listening to the radio, Mary learned about an investigator who had successfully resolved 8 murder cases related to the notorious burning Mississippi murders orchestrated by the Ku Klux Klan. These cases had remained unsolved for a half a century until he managed to crack them. Hearing about this gave Mary another push that she needed. Without delay, Mary embarked on a mission to obtain his contact information. Fortunately, she succeeded in locating his number. This individual, a resident of Mississippi, was Jerry Mitchell, and Jerry's answer was simple. After briefing Jerry on the case, Mary discovered that Felix had relocated to Mississippi. Faced with this revelation, Mary confronted a straightforward decision that she needed to make. In 2011, the two of them journeyed to Mississippi and arrived at the pivotal location, a secluded and desolate trailer park. However, 64-year-old Mary was least bothered. All she wanted was to end the chapter of Felix Vale. As Mary emerged from the house, she and Jerry noticed an individual rushing in their direction. Yet it wasn't Felix Vale. Instead, it was his sister, Kay Faulkner. At first, Kay was incensed by their unexpected presence, but her anger quickly subsided upon learning the purpose of Mary and Jerry Mitchell's visit. Recognizing the rapid progress achieved merely a day into the investigation, Jerry Mitchell capitalized on the momentum without delay. He proceeded to interview the Hortons, Hensleys, and Mary Rose, resulting in the publication of a book titled Gone in 2015, a mere 4 years later. This book carefully recorded the stories and experiences of the families. It quickly gained significant praise and received multiple awards. This development caught the attention of the FBI, who, comprehending the intricate details, made the decision to reopen the case. After a prolonged period of struggle, Mary finally experienced a sense of genuine happiness. The FBI meticulously reviewed all available information and opted to prioritize Mary Horton's case primarily because her death was confirmed. Unlike Sharon and Annette, whose bodies were never found. However, the challenge lay in the fact that this case dated back around more than 50 years, causing reports and data to be lost over time. Nevertheless, the FBI persisted in their efforts, even as they sought a district attorney willing to tackle this complex and antiquated case. And they finally found the right person for the job. It was Hugh Holland. Hugh Holland wasted no time and swiftly deployed a squad to raid Felix's residence as the initial step. In the journals, Felix described how he even liked to drink raw blood. However, nothing related to the murders was there. Now Holland decided to find someone who would know anything about the Calcasieu incident in 1962, where Mary Horton had drowned. And surprisingly, they found a man. He was 90-year-old Isaac Absher. During their meeting, as Holland conversed with Absher, who was confined to a wheelchair, Absher handed him an envelope. The contents of the envelope turned out to be photographs depicting Mary Horton's body on the day of its discovery, revealing extensive bruising and injuries. Holland took a hold of the photographs and commenced his examination when he finally got the conclusion. Armed with substantial evidence and the necessary proof, Holland swiftly pressed charges against 76-year-old Felix Vale for the murder of his first wife, Mary Horton. In a fitting twist of fate, the very place where the saga had begun, Louisiana, also became the site where it finally reached its conclusion. In 2014, this marked the moment of reckoning as Felix was apprehended and arrested. Throughout the trial, Sharon and Annette's disappearances were also highlighted. Vale was, after all, the last person to see them both. Recognizing the pivotal role of Absher's testimony in the case, Holland requested Absher to provide his testimony, acknowledging its significance as the most crucial piece of evidence in the entire proceedings. Merely 3 months after delivering his testimony, Isaac Absher passed away on May 17, 2014, due to old age at his residence. Nonetheless, his testimony proved to be a decisive factor that dispelled all doubts during the court proceedings. It just took the jury approximately 10 minutes to get the final decision. Felix Vale was found guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment. While Felix's involvement in Annette's and Sharon's disappearance was not definitively established, Mary and Brian found a sense of peace in the fact that he was held accountable for his actions and finally received the justice he deserved. With Felix incarcerated and justice achieved, Mary's relentless pursuit was vindicated. Nevertheless, the emotional wound in her heart remained unhealed, a reminder of the enduring pain she had endured. Seeking solace from her lingering guilt of having left her daughter due to work, Mary found a coping mechanism in writing letters as though they were intended for Annette to read, with a hope that one day she would finally be able to forgive herself. In today's episode, we're back in Las Vegas, a city that never sleeps, with anything and everything happening all hours of the day and night, home to over 500,000 people, one of which was Shauna and Castleton. Shauna had grown up in a Mormon family in Salt Lake City, and in 1994, at the age of 28, she decided to make the big move to Las Vegas, 500 miles away. For a while, she worked selling cosmetics at Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus. But Shauna loved the fun, glitz and glamour of Vegas nightlife and saw a lot of opportunity for herself in this environment. She started working as a cocktail waitress at the Fiesta before moving to one of the most popular and prestigious casinos in the area, the Palms Hotel Casino. She settled in quickly. Her colleagues became a second family for her. Her customers loved her, and Shauna adored her job. Those that knew her said she was always laughing and living in the moment. Her friends said she had an innocence about her. She was a free spirit and always had a positive outlook on things, no matter the situation. In 2002, Shauna met George Tefa at the Palms. George would go there a lot, and he said he was quick to notice Shauna because of how hard she worked. She was always busy running around and keeping guests happy. George was a star athlete and homecoming king at his school, and his family say he was charismatic, funny, and charming, always one to lend a hand to those that needed it. He had trained at the United States Military Academy, also known as West Point, and was now working as a firefighter. The attraction was instant, and the pair hit it off straight away, becoming inseparable immediately. George told his sisters that Shauna was his whole world, and a year later their world got a little bigger when they welcomed a baby girl whom they called Madison. Friends said George was very protective of his new family and Shauna was besotted with her little girl. A couple of years later, George and Shauna married in a beautiful beach wedding in Hawaii. 2 more years would pass by all accounts with everything staying the same as it had always been. That was until George suffered a huge setback with his finances. He lost a lot of money in the housing market crash, making Shauna the main earner for the family, and the financial stress began to impact the couple. Shauna eventually confided in people that George had become quite jealous and resentful, and wasn't long before his behavior escalated and became more controlling. On one occasion, George said she looked like a slut on her way to work one day. Made all the worse, she said, because her little girl had heard it. She told friends things got even more strange when he befriended a homeless man, getting him to do odd jobs around the house and garden. Shauna said she found the man creepy, and whenever he was around, it really unsettled her. Tensions continued to mount in the relationship, and with so much financial strain, coupled with George's sudden and spiteful change in personality, Shauna moved out and into her own townhouse apartment in Summerlin. The pair started sharing custody of Maddie as well as seeing a marriage counselor. Shauna was devastated at the breakdown of the relationship, and although she was hopeful they might one day make things work, she also knew divorce was a strong possibility. She would send George a text that read, "I don't think there's any going back." George was also upset and told people that the complications divorce would bring wasn't something he wanted to go through. After living apart for a while, Shauna was beginning to find a new routine. She was still working long hours and was always busy, but the love she had for her job meant she didn't mind. After one late shift, Shauna returned home to find her apartment had been broken into, and everything was a mess. Several precious and sentimental valuables, including her engagement ring, had been stolen. One item that had been taken that struck everyone as odd were her bikini bottoms. Whoever had broken in had also left some boxer briefs inside. Shauna was frightened and on edge, but did her best to put the incident behind her. Shauna clocked off and left work as normal just after 3 a.m. She lived about a 30-minute drive away from her apartment and arrived home at around 3:30 a.m. She parked up outside and went inside via the door in her garage. George had just finished a long shift at the fire department and picked up 8-year-old Maddie from her grandmother's. They both drove over to Shauna's to collect some of Maddie's belongings. They entered Shauna's home to find that it had been totally ransacked. Shauna Tefa was lying dead on the floor. It was clear from the position of the blood and Shauna's body she had been attacked as she had gone upstairs. The injuries to her body indicated the murder weapon was likely a hammer, and she had suffered horrendously in her last moments. Her skull was crushed and her fingers were broken from trying to protect herself. There was a hole in the side of her head that was so deep, at first paramedics believed she had been shot. A neighbor reported to the police that they had heard a thudding sound coming from the apartment between 3:30 and 4 a.m., but as she normally arrived home at this time, it didn't seem out of the ordinary. A little while later, another neighbor contacted police after finding Shauna's phone, health card, and some of her makeup along the side of a road nearby. As is common with most cases, her estranged husband George would be the first to be interviewed. George was at the fire station the day before and had worked a 24-hour shift. After confirming this with his colleagues, detectives were happy with his alibi, but this left police baffled and confused as to where to start looking. They didn't know if the burglary 3 weeks earlier was linked or was a scary coincidence. But as Shauna's belongings were found outside of her home, it was entirely possible that the same person had come back to take more things and, not realizing Shauna would be up and awake, killed her and fled the scene. They also didn't know if Shauna was a completely random target or if she was targeted for a specific reason. This left Shauna's casino colleagues fearful too. With all of them working similar shift patterns, could one of them be next? They wondered. But Shauna's sister, Paula, and her husband, however, believed there was a lot more to this than a random robbery gone wrong. Despite George's alibi, they still wanted to ask him some questions. Paula decided to give George a call and find out what was going on. George then passed the phone over to a grief counselor who was at the scene, and Paula just said exactly what she was thinking. After this, Paula and her husband hung up and booked the first flight out to Vegas, their minds going a million miles an hour. Paula said she would forever be haunted by the way in which her sister died. She said the excruciating pain she must have endured and the terror and realization that she was going to die. Just 24 hours after Sean's body was found, police received a tip-off that would blow the case wide open. A man that went by the name of Big Will told detectives he had a homeless friend that he knew only as Greyhound. Greyhound told him he had killed a woman with a hammer. Big Will recalled he wasn't scared. He wasn't upset or traumatized. He was laughing and happy as if he'd just completed a mission. Big Will told Greyhound that the second he saw anyone on the news that had been killed in the way he had told him, he would have to report him. And, as word spread that Shauna had been murdered, this confirmed to Big Will that Greyhound had been telling the truth. He went straight to the police. Greyhound was homeless and currently living in a tent on the outskirts of the city. Big Will said he would frequently go to a store called Albertsons to steal food and sell drugs in the gas station across the road. Authorities teamed up with Big Will and drove to these locations, believing this would be the best place to find him. They didn't have to wait long before they spotted him. When officers approached Greyhound, they found he had drugs on him and were able to put him up on drugs charges while they looked into Big Will's claims. Greyhound's real name was Noel Stevens. He was actually well known to police already for various reasons, including theft and drugs-related charges. While he admitted to selling drugs, he vehemently denied having anything to do with Shauna's death. Noel was a low-level criminal, and it was definitely a surprise that he would have traveled so far to commit such a huge crime without really leaving with anything he could have sold. Something wasn't making sense to the interviewing officers. There also didn't seem to be any connection between Noel and Shauna. Police managed to find out where he was sleeping, and, when he was in custody, began searching the area near his tent. The area was remote and very secluded, way up into the desert, away from everyone and everything. Officers worried that because the area was so vast, they could be searching for any potential evidence for weeks. But Noel had not dumped anything far away, and just a short walk away from his tent, they found a pair of his trousers, covered in blood, a price tag belonging to a hammer, and bloody pair of underwear. Back at the station, detectives were checking through his phone, and they soon found a single contact that seemed to tie everything together for them. George. When asked who George was, Noel said, "That's my friend, the firefighter." Noel Stevens was the man George Tefa had befriended, the same man Shauna had been wary about since the moment she met him. Police used the barcode for the hammer to find out where sold that particular make. And from this, they got hold of some CCTV that left them shocked. Camera inside the store clearly showed George Tefa and Noel Stevens shopping together and buying the hammer that would ultimately be used to kill Shauna. Officers now felt very strongly that George was at the center of what had happened to Shauna. Back at the station, officers presented Noel with all the evidence. Finally, Noel admitted to being Shauna's killer. But just as police already suspected, Noel said it was her estranged husband George that wanted her dead, and he had paid him $600 to carry out the crime on his behalf. Noel claimed that he and George had spent ages planning it. George had gotten a key cut for Noel, paid for some dark clothing for him, and had asked him to stage a robbery weeks before she was killed, almost like a practice run. Noel said that on September 29th, after he broke in, he hid in her closet for a while. He then moved into the living room and waited for her there as he heard her pulling up. Shauna was on her way up the stairs. Noel followed her up and began his attack there. He said she cried and begged for her life, screaming, "Why are you doing this?" over and over, as he struck her a total of 17 times. He then said the hammer broke and he continued to hit her with the hammerhead until she stopped moving. After retelling the shocking story, he offered to take detectives to where he had buried the hammerhead in the desert. Finally, they had the murder weapon. It had now been 9 days since Shauna was discovered that early September morning. And on October 8th, detectives informed George's mother and sister that he was now being investigated in relation to her death. They were horrified and adamant that he had nothing to do with it. A matter of minutes later, George's sister called her brother and told him. George jumped straight into his truck and set off on a fast and dangerous drive around Vegas. This would end in George going head-on into a concrete wall at the end of Summerlin Parkway and the Las Vegas Beltway. He was going more than 80 miles per hour. Authorities noted that there were no marks on the road, showing he hadn't tried to brake and stop the car, and this was an intentional crash and an attempt to take his own life. George survived thanks only to his seatbelt and was treated for his injuries at University Medical Center. 2 days later, officers arrived at George's hospital bed and informed him he was now under arrest. George's reply was simply, "Okay." He then asked if he could call his attorney, take a shower, and brush his teeth. Authorities felt they had a strong case and enough to bring charges forward against both men. Just 3 months later, Noel Stevens would plead guilty in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table, and said he would also testify for the prosecution as their star witness. He was sentenced to 42 years to life in prison. In August 2015, George, who was still pleading not guilty, entered the courtroom ready to begin his trial. Shauna's family were there for every single day, wearing her favorite color, pink. Her family gave lead prosecutor, Mark DiGiacomo, Shauna's lucky poker chip, which she kept with him as a good luck charm. George would never take the stand himself, but an array of witnesses, including his sisters and close friends, would testify about the man they said they really knew. A man they said was kind, compassionate, and hardworking, and would have no part in such a heinous crime. The prosecution felt their case was exceptionally strong. Alongside the CCTV and everything Noel had told them, they also had numerous phone records that showed that George had called Noel 87 times in the month of September 2012, and 5 times the night before the murder, an unbelievable amount of times for someone that just occasionally did the odd job here and there. The defense would argue, however, that the CCTV proved nothing. They were simply buying tools so Noel could continue to do work around the house. The star witness Noel took to the stand and told the court the same story, in all its detail, that he had told the police several years prior. He said alongside the $600 cash from George, he also made some more money off of Shauna's engagement ring, which he stole and then pawned. Noel also claimed that he was actually promised tens of thousands by George after the murder was carried out, and detectives believe Noel called George from the gas station phone the day after, which was possibly to arrange for the rest of the payment. This meeting, however, would never happen because that's the day the detectives made contact with Noel and he was taken in. Noel also testified that George had told him to use a fiberglass hammer because a wooden hammer might break during the attack. He said he took both hammers to the house but ended up using the wooden one, which did in fact break. Although the prosecution argued that everything Noel had said could be backed up by CCTV, phone records, and the time frame of events, while he was being cross-examined, Noel admitted to often having auditory and visual hallucinations. In the defense's eyes, this gave them enough reason to put forward the idea that Noel could have simply made the whole thing up. They weren't disputing that he killed Shauna, but the idea that George was involved was a lie. Robert Langford, George's attorney, said it was a good story, but nothing more than that. If you put it all together just the right way, that's what you get. But there's a lot of reason not to put it together that way, he said. It was said that Noel adored George, seeing him as a close friend and looking up to him in many ways. And the prosecution said that's all it took to be able to manipulate him very easily. They said George was the only one with a reason to want Shauna dead. They also believed that George may have been intending to kill Noel, as he had recently purchased a gun. If Noel had been killed, George would likely have got away with the crime completely. They, along with Shauna's family, felt George was someone that was so used to getting everything he wanted all his life and having vast amounts of success. After the couple's marriage began to spiral, and he was losing control over this as well as his finances, it was all too much for him to handle. Both teams finished presenting all their evidence, and the jury would spend 3 long days deliberating. As they announced they had come to a verdict, it was extremely tense in the courtroom, and no one could be sure which way things would go. Before they went in, Mark DiGiacomo said he put Shauna's lucky poker chip in his pocket. He was also given an additional 81 years for convictions of conspiracy, burglary, and robbery. The judge said in part, "My sentence today is not based upon holding you to a higher standard. My sentence is based upon the fact that this was just pure evil." Shauna's sister Paula was happy with the result, saying, "George is a controlling manipulator, and I think the worst hell for him would be standing in prison for the rest of his life and not being able to control anything." George decided he wanted to appeal the verdict. His 107-page appeal included handwritten notes from George himself. He wrote about himself in the third person, saying in part, the prescriptions altered his mind and removed his ability to know right from wrong, to the point that he thought God directed him to perpetrate a crime to protect his child. It appeared that, for the first time, he was now admitting to orchestrating the crime, but said it was because he was under the effects of prescription medication. An online fundraiser was set up to try and garner money to fund George's appeal, but his appeal was lost and his conviction upheld. George then claimed his lawyer, Robert Langford, was ineffective, ignored his mental health issues, and failed to request a psychiatric evaluation. He said he had suffered an injury years ago and took various painkillers and medications, including prescribed hormones and Adderall. Robert Langford said, "He never indicated any kind of psychosis or any kind of abnormal behavior and led me to believe he was anything other than competent and able to assist in his defense." He has since withdrawn from the case. Shauna's family went on to found Justice for Shauna, a group that raises awareness about domestic violence and abusive relationships. Her family would also later move her grave from Las Vegas back to her home state of Utah, so she could be next to her father. Maddie is now living with Shauna's mother and spends a lot of time with her Aunt Paula. Paula says whenever she talks about her mother, she smiles a lot, and it's clear that their relationship was always full of laughter and fun. Paula said the loss of her sister profoundly affected so many people, but the biggest tragedy is how her daughter will grow up without a mom that was so devoted to her. The judge that sentenced George said, "Why you of all people would do something that you know would be so cruel to so many people beyond just Shauna." It said that Shauna's biggest and purest joy in life was being a mother. And Paula would say, "I have no doubt she was thinking of sweet little Madison as she took her last breath." Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.